The village of Harrow's End lay bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the air thick with the scent of ripe corn and freshly turned earth. It was harvest season, a time when the community gathered to celebrate the land's bounty, to share stories and laughter beneath the broad sky. The festival preparations were in full swing. Stalls were being erected in the square, strings of autumn leaves hung from wooden beams, and the aroma of baking bread mingled with the crisp scent of drying hay. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of his fields, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading sun. His sharp blue eyes scanned the rows of tall stalks that stretched endlessly before him, their golden tassels gleaming as the light caught them. This year, the crops were unlike any he had seen in decades, lush, vibrant, almost unnaturally so. His weathered hands brushed over a stalk's leaves, feeling the thick, waxy texture. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity, a subtle unease gnawed at him. He had heard the whispers. At first he dismissed them, his mind playing tricks after long days of labor. But now, as twilight deepened and the wind stirred the corn, those faint murmurs seemed to rise and fall like a secret conversation just beyond hearing. No one else spoke openly of it, but he caught the wary glances exchanged between neighbors, the quick hush when a stranger approached. The village felt different, as if a shadow had slipped quietly into its heart. Inside the farmhouse, the kettle boiled over a crackling fire, casting a warm glow on the wooden walls lined with farming tools and well-worn photographs. Eli, Thomas's younger brother, sat uneasily at the kitchen table, his dark eyes wide as he recounted what he had heard the night before. "Thomas, I swear I heard voices, whispers coming from the fields. Not the wind, not any animal, but words. I can't explain it, but it felt like they were calling to me." Thomas sighed, rubbing the tired lines from his forehead. "Eli, you know I don't put stock in old wives' tales. The land's been good to us, and that's all there is to it. Maybe you just had a bad dream." Eli looked down, unconvinced but unwilling to press further. The brothers' conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Maggie Ellis entered, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she smiled gently. "Thomas, there's talk in the village another person's gone missing." The news settled over the room like a cold fog. Thomas's heart tightened. Disappearances were rare in Harrow's End, a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep. And yet, here was a second name being whispered into the growing list. "We need to be careful," Maggie said softly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this land, old stories, about the cost of prosperity and the price paid in silence." Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Outside, the corn rustled once more, the whispers rising with the wind as if the fields themselves were alive and watching. That evening, as darkness cloaked the village, Thomas took his usual walk along the field's edge. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The corn swayed rhythmically, the stalks whispering secrets in a language just out of reach. He stopped, listening intently, his skin prickling. There it was again, a faint voice, a murmur threading through the rustling stalks. It was neither wind nor animal, but something older, something that seemed to pulse with the land itself. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, though his voice betrayed a tremor of doubt. As he turned to leave, a sudden rustle from deeper in the field startled him. His heart hammered as shadows shifted between the stalks. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure, tall, dark, and fleeting, before it vanished into the night. Returning to the village, Thomas found Sheriff Daniel Crow standing watch outside his office, his face set in a grim line. "You hear anything strange out there?" the sheriff asked, his voice low. Thomas hesitated. "Maybe, but I'm not one for ghost stories." Crow shook his head, his weather-beaten face hardening. Neither am I, but there's talk, and people are scared. We need to keep our eyes open. As the night deepened, the village settled uneasily into silence. Inside their homes, families whispered prayers and clung to old superstitions. But outside, the cornfields whispered on, their voices threading through the wind, growing stronger, calling for something only the darkness could understand. The harvest festival was days away, yet already the shadows had begun to gather, and Thomas Grady, pragmatic and steadfast, found himself standing at the edge of a mystery that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Evening settled over Harrow's End with a slow, creeping weight that seemed to press down on everything beneath the purpling sky. Thomas Grady stood on the worn wooden porch of the Ellis farmhouse, the boards groaning softly beneath his boots as he waited for Maggie to finish her preparations inside. The air held a chill, a breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks and carrying faint, unintelligible whispers from the cornfields beyond the village's edge. Thomas rubbed his hands together, the unease gnawing at the edges of his skepticism. Maggie appeared at the doorway, a small leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hands. Her auburn hair caught the last light of day, and her kind eyes held a solemnity that was new to Thomas. "Come inside," she said quietly, beckoning him into the warm glow of the kitchen. The scent of herbs and wood smoke mingled in the air as they settled opposite each other at the worn table. "You really believe those stories your grandmother told you?" Thomas asked, his voice low but edged with disbelief. Maggie's fingers traced the faded cover of the journal. "I never wanted to believe them either, but something's changed this year. The crops, the whispers, the disappearances. It all fits with what my grandmother said. There's a darkness tied to this land, Thomas. Something old, something that demands a price." Thomas leaned forward, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. "But those are just stories, folk tales passed down to scare children. We're farmers, Maggie. We work the land, we reap what it gives us." She shook her head slowly, flipping the book open to a page filled with cramped handwriting and strange symbols. "Look at this. My grandmother wrote this down years ago, from the old tales and warnings. It speaks of a pact made by the village founders, a covenant with the land that required sacrifice to ensure prosperity." A sudden sharp rap at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Daniel Crow stood on the porch, his stocky frame silhouetted against the fading light. His weather-beaten face was set in a grim expression, eyes scanning the room before settling on Thomas. "Evening, Grady. Heard there's been another disappearance," Crow said, his voice gruff but carrying the weight of growing concern. Thomas nodded. "That's what Maggie and I were just talking about. Something's wrong with this harvest." Crow's gaze hardened. "I don't put much stock in ghost stories and old wives' tales, but the village is on edge. I'm stepping up patrols. No one's to wander near the fields after dark." Maggie exchanged a glance with Thomas, the unspoken fear hanging heavy between them. Later that night, Thomas found himself drawn to the edge of the cornfields. The moon hung low and pale in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted among the rustling stalks. The whispers had grown clearer, more insistent, like voices carried on the wind just beyond comprehension. He paused, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "Who's there?" he whispered, voice trembling despite his resolve. The rustling intensified, voices overlapping in a sibilant chorus that seemed to seep into his very bones. He staggered back, heart pounding, yet a fierce determination ignited within him. If the land held a dark secret, he would unearth it. For the sake of Harrow's End, for the people he was bound to protect. Days passed, and the village's unease deepened. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, conversations hushed and filled with fear. Sheriff Crow's patrols brought little comfort, his skepticism clashing with the growing dread that gripped the community. Inside Maggie's kitchen, the journal lay open between them, its cryptic passages a grim map to the past. "We have to find out more," Maggie urged. "If this pact is real, if the land demands a sacrifice, then we need to prepare." Thomas nodded slowly, the pragmatist within him battling the rising tide of belief. The echoes of the past were no longer just stories, they were warnings, shadows stretching across the harvest, whispering of darkness that would not be ignored. As the night deepened, the whispers continued, a haunting lullaby that promised dread and demanded a reckoning. Thomas clenched his fists, knowing that the peace of Harrow's end was slipping through their fingers like dry soil. The harvest was no longer a time of joy, was the beginning of a nightmare, and Thomas Grady was determined to face it, no matter the cost. The wind shifted, carrying the whispers once more. The fields were alive with secrets, and the shadows waited patiently. Evening settled over Harrow's End with a quiet that felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that presses down and makes your skin crawl. Thomas Grady stood on the porch of the village library, the rough wood cool beneath his hands as he leaned forward, squinting at the fragile pages spread before him. Beside him, Maggie Ellis traced her finger along the faded ink, her auburn hair catching the last glimmers of daylight. "These records," she whispered, "they speak of a pact made long ago." Thomas frowned, skepticism tightening his features. Pacts and legends. Nothing but stories to scare children and keep people in line. Maggie's eyes met his, steady and insistent. But what if there's truth to them? What if the land itself demands a price? Outside, the cornfields stretched endlessly, their stalks rustling softly as the wind slipped through. But beneath the gentle susurrus, a whisper threaded a voice too faint to catch clearly, but unsettling nonetheless. "Did you hear that?" Maggie asked, glancing toward the fields. Thomas shook his head. "It's just the wind." But the village was no longer so sure. At the town square earlier that afternoon, a gathering had erupted into a fierce dispute. Some villagers clung to rational explanations. Missing people had run off, perhaps victims of accidents or mischief. Others whispered of curses and dark bargains, their voices trembling with fear. The tension was palpable, like a storm threatening to break. Eli Grady, Thomas's younger brother, was among the believers. That evening, Thomas found him standing at the edge of the cornfield, eyes wide in the moonlight, listening intently. The whispers had grown louder, almost insistent, as if the land itself was calling out. "You have to believe me," Eli said later that night, his voice low and urgent during a tense conversation in Thomas's kitchen. "The whispers, they're real. They know us. They want something." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair, frustration and fear twisting inside him. "I want to believe you, Eli, but I need proof, something solid." Their words hung in the air, fragile as the flickering oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the cornfields whispered on, carrying secrets that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Harrow's End. As the night deepened, restless villagers tossed and turned in their beds, haunted by the growing chorus of voices from the fields. The seeds of fear had taken root, and with them, the fragile trust of the community began to wither. Thomas and Maggie knew they had to dig deeper to uncover the truth buried beneath centuries of dust and silence. But with each revelation, the shadows grew longer, and the price of knowledge more terrifying. The harvest was coming, and with it, the darkness whispered promises no one could ignore. The chapter closes on Thomas standing once more at the edge of the cornfield, the voices rising around him like a gathering storm. A chill ran down his spine as he braced himself for what was to come. The weight of legacy pressing down like the soil beneath his feet. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were warnings. And the village was running out of time. The morning of the harvest festival dawned with a deceptive calm over Harrow's End. The sun cast a warm golden glow over the lush fields, the corn standing tall and proud, as if eager to show off its bounty. The village square was alive with preparations. Children ran between stalls adorned with autumnal decorations. The scent of fresh bread and spiced cider wafted through the air, and laughter mingled with the clatter of pots and pans. Yet beneath this cheerful facade, an undercurrent of unease threaded through the crowd. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the square, his sharp blue eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors. He noted the forced smiles, the quick glances exchanged behind hands, the murmurs that seemed to stop whenever he approached. The disappearance of the third villager, Mary Linton, had come just hours before the festival's opening ceremony, and the shock rippled through the community like a cold wind. "Did you hear? Mary was last seen near the east field," whispered an elderly man to a woman clutching her shawl tighter. No one saw anything, but the corn was moving differently. Thomas's thoughts churned. He had spent the previous night walking the perimeter of his fields, trying to listen to the whispers that had grown louder in recent days. But now, with the festival underway, the whispers had taken on a darker tone, more urgent, more demanding. He made his way toward the cornfields bordering the village, where the tall stalks rustled unnaturally despite the still morning air. As he approached, a strange sensation prickled at his skin, a mixture of cold and dread. Near the edge, he spotted something that made his heart skip a series of symbols etched into the soil and carved into the lower stalks of corn. They were crude but unmistakable, spirals and jagged lines intertwined like a twisted vine. Kneeling down, Thomas traced the markings with a trembling finger. The earth felt cold and damp beneath him, and a faint metallic scent hung in the air. The shadows deepened as clouds passed over the sun, and for a moment, the rustling of the corn seemed to form words, whispers carried on the wind, voices half-heard and chilling. Blood, they seemed to say, blood for growth. A sudden rustle to his right made Thomas jerk upright. His eyes darted toward the movement, but all he saw was the swaying corn, the shadows shifting like living things. His breath caught in his throat as a vague humanoid shape flickered at the edge of the field, dissolving into the mist with a whisper that sent shivers down his spine. Without hesitation, Thomas hurried back to the village, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a stone. He sought out Maggie Ellis first. She was tending to her small stall, her auburn hair pulled back, her kind eyes narrowing with concern as he approached. "Maggie, you need to see this," Thomas said, his voice low but urgent. Together, they returned to the field. Maggie's gaze grew serious as she examined the symbols. "These markings, they match some of the illustrations in my grandmother's journal," she murmured. "They're warnings, signs of a pact, a demand for sacrifice." Thomas's jaw tightened. But why now? Why the disappearances? Before Maggie could respond, Sheriff Daniel Crow appeared, his weather-beaten face grim. "I heard about Mary," he said. "We're increasing patrols, but the villagers are scared. Some are blaming each other." Thomas met the sheriff's eyes. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. These markings, the whispers, it's not just superstition anymore. Something is coming from the fields, and it's hungry." Sheriff Crow sighed, the skepticism in his gaze giving way to a reluctant acceptance. "All right, Grady, but we'll need more than symbols and whispers if we're going to calm this town. As night fell, the festival's festive lights cast long shadows over the village. But in the distance, the cornfields whispered relentlessly, the voices growing louder, more demanding. The villagers huddled in their homes, eyes darting nervously toward the darkened fields, wondering who might vanish next. Thomas stood once more at the edge of the corn, the cold soil beneath his hands, and listened. The harvest spirit was no longer a distant legend. It was present, palpable, and waiting, and it was thirsting for blood. The chapter closed with Thomas's breath visible in the chill night air as he whispered to the darkness, "We can't let it win, not this year." But deep in the shadows, the whispers twisted like serpents, promising that the price of the harvest was far from paid. The ancestral pact the day had begun under a heavy grey sky, the kind of overcast that seemed to mute the colors of the world and drain the warmth from the air. Thomas Grady stood outside the weathered door of Old Man Harrow's cabin, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. The old man had requested his company, something rare and always tinged with gravity. Though Thomas was pragmatic and skeptical by nature, he had learned to respect the elder's knowledge, especially when the strange happenings in Harrow's End began to escalate beyond simple explanation. Pushing open the creaking door, Thomas stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit by a single flickering oil lamp and a small, sputtering fireplace. The scent of dried herbs mingled with the musty odor of old wood and paper. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars, trinkets, and dusty tomes. Old Man Harrow sat in a high-backed wooden chair, his bent frame wrapped in a thick shawl. His piercing grey eyes met Thomas's with an intensity that seemed to peer through the veils of time. "You've come at last," the elder rasped, his voice like gravel shifting in a dry stream. "There are things you need to know, lad. Things that have been buried beneath this land for longer than any living soul can remember." Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I need to understand what's happening to the village," he said, his voice steady despite the dread curling within him. Old Man Harrow gestured to a battered wooden table. Upon it lay a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and edges frayed. "This," he said, "is the key. It belonged to one of the village founders, a man who made a choice no living man should ever be forced to make." Carefully, Thomas reached out and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with looping cursive handwriting and strange symbols interspersed with sketches of corn stalks entwined with human figures. As he scanned the text, a story unfolded, a story of desperation and dark bargains. Decades ago, when the village was little more than a scattering of farms struggling against poor soil and harsh seasons, the founders faced ruin. Crops failed, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and death loomed. In their desperation, they turned to an ancient force bound to the land, a spirit neither wholly benevolent nor entirely malevolent, but demanding. A pact was forged, prosperity in exchange for sacrifice. The journal detailed rituals performed in secret, offerings made under moonlight, and the chilling requirement of human blood to nourish the earth. The prosperity that followed had been undeniable. The crops grew tall and golden, feeding generations. But the cost, the journal warned, was a debt that could never be fully repaid. Thomas's heart pounded as he closed the journal. This can't be real," he whispered. "It's just stories." Old Man Harrow shook his head slowly. "Stories that saved us once, and now threaten to consume us. The whispers you hear in the fields, they are the spirit's voice. It hungers still." Later that evening, Thomas met with Maggie Ellis in the quiet of her farmhouse kitchen. The soft glow from a kerosene lamp painted their faces in warm hues, but the atmosphere was anything but comforting. Maggie's auburn hair caught the light as she spread the journal's contents across the table. "I've been through every page," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There are passages here that describe how to break the curse. It won't be easy, and it won't be without risk. But we have to try." Thomas ran a hand through his darkening hair, frustration and fear warring within him. "I want to believe there's a way out, Maggie. But if the spirit demands sacrifice, what hope do we have?" She reached across the table, her eyes steady. "We have each other, and the knowledge that the past doesn't have to dictate the future." That night, Thomas found himself walking the edge of the cornfields, the tall stalks whispering in the cold wind. The moon cast pale light, and shadows danced between the rustling leaves. The whispers were clearer now, a haunting chorus of voices, both pleading and threatening. He clutched the journal tightly, feeling the weight of his ancestors' sins pressing down on him. Could he protect Harrow's end from a darkness born of its own making? Could he face the legacy of blood and shadow without losing himself? The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. As the first light of dawn bled into the sky, Thomas knew the coming days would test every ounce of his resolve. The ancestral pact was no longer a secret buried in dusty pages. It was a living nightmare creeping through the cornfields, whispering for sacrifice and demanding a reckoning. And Thomas Grady would have to decide whether to break the cycle or become part of it. The chapter closes with an unsettling silence, the quiet before the storm, as Harrow's End braces itself for the horrors yet to come. The weight of history presses heavy, and the line between tradition and terror blurs beneath the endless stalks of corn. The air in Harrow's End had shifted, thick with a restless energy that crawled beneath the skin and lodged itself deep in the bones. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a blood-orange glow over the ragged silhouettes of the cornfields, the village square swelled with anxious voices. Neighbors who once exchanged warm greetings now eyed each other with wary suspicion, their conversations laced with accusation and dread. "It's them," whispered a gaunt woman, clutching her shawl tightly. "I saw Thomas near the edge of the fields last night, talking to no one. What if he's involved?" The murmurs rippled like wildfire. Thomas Grady stood a few paces away, his jaw set, blue eyes scanning the restless crowd. The farmer, known for his pragmatic mind and steady hands, felt the sting of betrayal more keenly than any wound. He knew the villagers' fear was justified, yet it threatened to tear them apart just when unity was their only hope. Sheriff Daniel Crow stepped forward, his stocky frame dominating the discord. "Enough," he barked, his voice carrying the weight of authority but edged with a weariness born from sleepless nights. "This chaos solves nothing. We're enforcing a strict curfew starting tonight. Anyone caught wandering after dark will be detained." A chorus of reluctant agreements and fearful grumbles met his decree. The sheriff's eyes flickered over the crowd, noting the fractures that fear had carved into the once tight-knit community. He glanced toward Thomas, silently imploring him to help restore order. Later, in the dim quiet of the sheriff's office, Crow pinned fresh curfew notices to the battered bulletin board. The scratching of his nails against the wood was the only sound, save for the distant rustling of the fields beyond the windows. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, slipping through cracks and seeping into dreams. Meanwhile, beneath the gnarled limbs of the ancient oak that marked the village center, Thomas sat beside Maggie Ellis. The schoolteacher's auburn hair caught the last glimmers of twilight as her kind eyes scanned the faded pages of the journal she had uncovered. The brittle paper smelled of dust and time, The ink faded, but the words potent with forbidden knowledge. "The pact," Maggie murmured, tracing a line of cursive that spoke of sacrifice and blood. "It's real. And it's not just history, it's happening again." Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of his ancestors' sins settling like a stone in his chest. "We have to find a way to stop it," he said, voice low but resolute. "If the crops want blood, they'll get it. But not if we can help it." The cornfields whispered around them as twilight deepened into night, their voices weaving a sinister lullaby that wrapped cold fingers around their resolve. Not far off, Eli Grady stood at the field's edge, breath fogging the chill air. His eyes darted nervously among the stalks, wide with terror as the voices crescendoed around him. The whispers clawed at his mind, promising salvation in exchange for surrender. He shivered, torn between fear and fascination, isolation pressing in like the thick soil beneath his feet. Back in the village, the fractures widened. Neighbors who once trusted each other now exchanged wary glances and curt words. The curfew kept them inside, but it could not contain the growing dread that seeped into every corner of Harrow's End. Thomas and Maggie's alliance became a beacon amid the darkness, their shared determination a fragile thread holding hope together. Yet even as they planned their next move, the whispers grew bolder, demanding a price that chilled their blood. The night deepened, and the village held its breath. Somewhere in the rustling stalks, the harvest spirit waited, patient and hungry, its shadow stretching long over the fractured trust of Harrow's End. And as the moon rose high, the question hung heavy in the air: would unity prevail, or would fear consume them all? The night had come heavy and thick, pressing against the windows of Thomas Grady's modest farmhouse like a living thing. Sleep had been a stranger these past days, and tonight, when his body finally succumbed, his mind betrayed him with vivid nightmares, darker than any he had known. He dreamed of the cornfields, those endless seas of whispering green alive and watching. The stalks rustled in tongues only the cursed could understand, voices both ancient and agonized. Shadows coiled and writhed through the rows, coalescing into a towering figure of shifting darkness, its eyes glowing with a hunger that chilled Thomas to his core. It reached out, tendrils of shadow brushing against his skin, whispering demands in a voice that was the rustle of 1,000 leaves and the silence that follows a scream. Thomas jolted awake, heart pounding, sweat slicking his skin. He sat on the edge of his bed, the images clinging to his mind like a suffocating fog. This was no ordinary fear. It was real as the soil beneath his feet and the creeping dread that had begun to grip Harrow's End. Morning light did little to ease the weight of the night. At the village hall, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The harvest festival preparations that once inspired hope now felt like a fragile mask over an unraveling nightmare. Villagers gathered, their faces drawn and eyes wary, voices low but charged with fear. Sheriff Daniel Crow stood at the front, his usual gruff demeanor shadowed by exhaustion. "We need order," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "But I can't promise we'll find answers tonight." Maggie Ellis stepped forward, her auburn hair catching the weak sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. "We can't ignore what's happening," she implored, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "The whispers, the disappearances, they're connected. I've been studying the old journals. The land demands a price." Skeptics scoffed, their disbelief a fragile shield against the encroaching horror. "Folklore won't save us," one man spat. "We need facts, not ghost stories." The room erupted into heated debate, voices rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. Thomas listened, caught between his innate skepticism and the mounting evidence clawing at his reason. As dusk settled, the villagers convened at the edge of the cornfields for a ritual born of desperation. Bundles of corn, flickering candles, and tattered trinkets were laid on an improvised altar of stones and earth. Faces were pale, hands trembling, voices barely above whispers as they recited prayers and old incantations passed down through generations. Thomas stood beside Maggie and Sheriff Crow, the three of them bound by a shared urgency. "This has to work," Maggie whispered, her eyes searching the darkening horizon where the stalks swayed unnaturally as if breathing. But the fields answered not with peace, but with fury. As night deepened, the rustling grew violent. Stalks bent and snapped, whipping through the air with unnatural force. The wind carried screams raw, primal, and full of anguish, echoing through the village and shattering the fragile calm. People scattered, desperate to escape the unseen terror. Yet the cornfields seemed to consume those who fled, swallowing them into the earth. Blood seeped into the soil where the missing had vanished, dark and fresh against the pale dirt. Thomas's heart hammered as he witnessed the chaos, the curse's appetite insatiable and growing. In the aftermath, silence fell heavy and oppressive. The village was left shaken, scarred by loss and haunted by the knowledge that their ritual had failed. The harvest spirit had not been appeased. It had been enraged. Thomas clenched his fists, determination hardening within him. The whispers were no longer just voices in the wind. They were a call to action, a summons to face the darkness that had taken root beneath their feet. Whatever the cost, he vowed to uncover the truth and protect Harrow's End from the malevolent force that threatened to consume them all. But as the night stretched on, an unsettling thought crept into his mind. What if the spirit's hunger could never be satisfied, and the cycle of sacrifice was endless? And so, under the watchful gaze of the whispering corn, the harvest of shadows had truly begun. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the oldest cornfield in Harrow's End, the stalks towering above him like a living wall of gold and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of earth and ripening corn, but beneath it was something else, something far older and darker. Faint whispers drifted through the rustling leaves, voices so soft they might have been imagined, yet unmistakably there. They tugged at Thomas's senses, a murmur that promised secrets and dreadful truths. He hesitated, the weight of his ancestors' legacy pressing on his shoulders as the whispers grew into an unbearable urgency. For all his skepticism, the evidence was mounting. Villagers were vanishing, the soil soaked with blood, and the land itself seemed to demand a terrible price. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped forward, the dry stalks crunching underfoot as he ventured deeper into the maze of corn. The twilight shadows lengthened, wrapping the field in an eerie embrace. Every rustle, every breath of wind seemed to carry voices just beyond comprehension. Thomas paused to listen, heart pounding. The whispers spoke of sacrifice, of blood, and of a restless spirit bound to the soil. Memories of Old Man Harrow's warnings and Maggie Ellis's journal flickered through his mind, each piece fitting into a grim puzzle. After what felt like hours wandering, Thomas stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight revealed a stone altar, half swallowed by creeping vines and ancient symbols etched deep into its surface. Dark stains marred the cold rock-fresh blood glistened in the pale light. The air here was heavier, suffused with a malevolent presence that seemed to press against his skin like invisible hands. Thomas's breath hitched as the whispers rose to a crescendo, voices overlapping in a maddening chorus that clawed at his sanity. Shadows coalesced at the edges of his vision, shifting and writhing like living things. He glimpsed vague humanoid shapes emerging from the mist, their forms dissolving just as quickly as they appeared. The harvest spirit was here, its hunger palpable in the chilling breeze. Panic surged through him, adrenaline fueling his flight as he tore back through the cornfield. Behind him, the whispers chased, a relentless tide of ancient hunger and dark promises. Thomas's footsteps pounded against the earth as he raced toward the village. The altar and its grim truth etched into his memory. Reaching the edge of the field, he turned once to see the shadows recede, the voices fading into a low, sinister murmur. The weight of what he had discovered settled over him like a shroud, but beneath the dread burned a fierce resolve. He would uncover the full truth behind the harvest spirit and the cursed land, no matter the cost. Yet even as he made this silent vow, Thomas knew the path ahead would be fraught with terror and sacrifice. The cornfields whispered still, waiting, hungry, and the shadows promised that the darkness was far from over. The night deepened, the village lights twinkling distantly like fragile beacons against the encroaching dark. Thomas stood at the threshold of the haunted fields, caught between the tangible world and the ancient curse that clung to the soil. His journey into the heart of the darkness had only just begun. And somewhere in the depths of the whispering corn, the harvest spirit watched, patient and relentless, waiting for the next move in its deadly game. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint rustle of restless corn stalks as Thomas Grady sat alone at the worn kitchen table of his family farmhouse. The only light came from a flickering oil lamp, its weak glow casting long shadows on the peeling walls. Where a faded portrait of his great-grandfather hung a stern man with eyes as sharp and unyielding as Thomas's own. He traced the outline of the frame absently, his mind entangled in the weight of the ancestral legacy that had suddenly become all too real. For years, Thomas had dismissed the old stories as nothing more than superstition and folklore, relics of a bygone era clung to by a fading generation. Yet, the events unfolding in Harrow's End were shaking him to his core. The whispers that haunted the cornfields, the vanishings, the terrible sense that the very earth beneath his feet was alive with something ancient and hungry. It was all connected to his family's past, and more specifically, to the pact forged by his ancestors. He opened a battered, leather-bound folder, carefully unfolding brittle letters and yellowed documents that had been passed down through generations. The script was hurried and faded, but the meaning was unmistakable. A covenant made in desperation, a sacrifice demanded in exchange for the land's bounty. Thomas's jaw tightened as he read the chilling details, each word sinking like a stone in his gut. Across the room, the clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time with a cold, indifferent rhythm. Thomas pressed his palm against the table, trying to steady the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The burden of legacy was heavier than any harvest he had ever reaped. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. Maggie Ellis stepped inside, her auburn hair catching the lamp's glow, her expression both concerned and resolute. In her hands, she carried the fragile journal she had discovered buried beneath the floorboards of her grandmother's old house. Tome filled with cryptic passages and faded ink that promised answers. "Thomas," she said quietly, settling into the chair opposite him, "I've been poring over this journal all day. There's more here than I expected: rituals, warnings, even hints at how we might break the curse. But the language is old, and the meaning isn't always clear." He nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. "Anything that helps us understand what we're dealing with is worth the effort. The more I learn about my family's past, the more I realize how deep this goes." Together, they leaned over the fragile pages, the flickering lamp casting eerie shadows as they pieced together the fragments of history and horror. The journal spoke of ancient rites performed beneath the moonlight, sacrifices offered to the land to ensure its fertility, and a spirit bound to the soil by blood and oath. It was a grim tapestry woven from desperation and dread. As the night deepened, the silence was broken by the uneasy arrival of Eli Grady, Thomas's younger brother. His face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and frustration. He wore his worn hat low, shadowing his features as he confronted Thomas outside the barn. "You can't keep ignoring it, Thomas," Eli said, voice trembling with emotion. "The whispers aren't just in your head. The land is angry. We have to listen to respect the old ways." Thomas folded his arms, the chill of the night and his brother's conviction pressing against him. "Eli, I want to believe you. But these aren't just old stories anymore. We have to find a way to stop this without giving in to fear." Their words hung heavy between them, a rift growing where brotherly trust once stood firm. Eli's superstitions deepened, a stark contrast to Thomas's rational approach, and the tension threatened to unravel the fragile unity of their family. As dawn approached, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the cornfields, the golden light spilling over the whispering stalks. The fields stretched endlessly, swaying gently in the morning breeze. The rustling was softer now, almost mournful, as if the land itself mourned the sacrifices it demanded. He closed his eyes, breathing in the earthy scent, feeling the pulse of something ancient beneath the soil. The legacy of his ancestors was not just a burden, it was a call to action, to protect his village, to honor the past, and to face the darkness that awaited him in the shadows of the harvest. But how could he break a cycle written in blood and fear? And what price would he have to pay to save Harrow's end? The answers lay somewhere in that whispered secrets of the cornfields, waiting for Thomas to uncover them before the next harvest claimed more lives. He turned back toward the farmhouse, determination hardening his features. The weight of legacy pressed on him, but Thomas Grady was no stranger to hard labor, and he would fight to the last breath to protect the land and the people he loved. Yet, as he crossed the threshold, a faint whisper curled round the edges of his minder, chilling reminder that some shadows never truly fade. The night air in Harrow's End had grown thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that presses against the skin and seeps into the bones. Thomas Grady stood on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, the pale glow of the crescent moon barely illuminating the endless sea of corn that stretched beyond the horizon. The rustling of the stalks had always been a familiar lullaby for the village, but tonight that lullaby twisted into something far darker. It began as faint whispers, barely audible above the gentle breeze, but as the hours deepened, the whispers grew louder, morphing into incoherent murmurs that seemed to crawl beneath the skin. Then, without warning, the whispers shattered into piercing screams that tore through the night like a blade. Thomas's heart pounded as the screams echoed across the fields, bouncing off the wooden facades of shuttered homes and awakening every soul in Harrow's End. Windows rattled in their frames, dogs howled in terror, and a heavy silence fell between the bursts of screams, each one more desperate than the last. Inside the sheriff's office, Sheriff Daniel Crow slammed his fist onto the rough-hewn desk, the sound sharp enough to startle the deputies gathered around. His weather-beaten face was drawn tight with frustration and fear. "We need more patrols out there," he barked, voice hoarse. "If those screams mean they're taking more folks, we can't just stand around waiting for the worst." His men nodded, the room heavy with tension. Crow's stoic exterior cracked momentarily as he rubbed his temples, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the thick summer heat. Despite his skepticism about the supernatural rumors that spread like wildfire, the brutal reality of the disappearances was undeniable. Meanwhile, Maggie Ellis hurried through the village lanes, her breath coming in short gasps as she moved from house to house, checking on neighbors and offering what comfort she could. At Sarah Pike's modest farmhouse, Maggie found the woman sitting on the creaking porch steps, her hands trembling, eyes wide and haunted. "Sarah," Maggie said gently, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this. We have to." Sarah's voice cracked as she responded, "But who's left to protect us? The fields. They're alive with screams. I don't know what's out there anymore." Maggie swallowed the lump in her throat, the burden of hope heavier than ever. A short distance away, Thomas moved toward the edge of the oldest cornfield. The stalks were taller here, their rustling more frantic and urgent. He paused, the chill of the night seeping through his jacket as he strained to listen. The screams had subsided into a low, eerie chorus of whispers again, but beneath them vibrated a primal menace. His eyes narrowed, blue piercing the darkness, as he whispered to himself, "This can't go on. I have to find out what's really behind this madness." The village was unraveling. Trust was fraying, and fear was a living thing that slithered through every conversation and glance. Sheriff Crow's patrols offered little comfort, their presence a thin shield against the unknown horrors lurking in the fields. As dawn crept over the horizon, the silence that followed the night's terror felt fragile and incomplete. The screams had stopped, but the terror they left in their wake clung stubbornly to the village, a shadow that refused to fade. Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The whispers would return, louder and more demanding. And unless they uncovered the truth soon, the heart of Harrow's end would be lost forever. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The fields whispered still, and he was listening. The cramped room where Maggie worked was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, the only illumination coming from a flickering oil lamp that cast long shadows across the wooden walls. She hunched over the ancient journal, her fingers tracing the faded ink as she painstakingly deciphered each word. The book had been a forgotten relic, buried beneath layers of dust in Old Man Harrow's collection. But now it was the key to understanding the growing terror that gripped Harrow's end. "Listen to this," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible over the restless wind rattling the window pane. "Each year, the land demands a blood price, a living offering to satisfy the hunger of the spirit that binds our fate. Without this sacrifice, the crops will wither and the village will fall to ruin." Thomas Grady stood behind her, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he absorbed the words. Skepticism warred with the mounting evidence, but the weight of the revelation settled heavily on his shoulders. "A living sacrifice," he murmured, almost disbelieving. "All this time, we thought it was just superstition." Maggie nodded solemnly. "It's worse than we feared. The journal even details the original pact made by our ancestors, desperate men who chose survival over morality. This curse has been feeding on human lives for generations." Outside, the whispering cornfields seemed to press closer, the rustling stalks murmuring secrets in the night air. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the cold grip of dread tightened around his heart. Word of Maggie's discovery spread quickly, and by nightfall the villagers gathered in the old community hall. The air was thick with unease, a palpable tension threading through the crowd as lanterns flickered, casting anxious glances among neighbors. Voices rose in heated debate. Some, like Sarah Pike, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, pleaded for compliance. If this is what the land demands, then maybe it's the only way to keep us safe. Better one sacrifice than the whole village lost to the darkness. Others, fueled by fear and defiance, balked at the thought. Eli, Grady, Thomas's younger brother, looked torn, his voice shaking as he argued, "We can't just give in to this madness. There has to be another way. We have to fight it, not surrender." Sheriff Daniel Crow, standing near the back with his arms crossed, cleared his throat. "I'm tasked with keeping the peace," he said gruffly. "But law and order don't mean much when faced with something like this. We need a plan, or we risk tearing the village apart with fear." Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "We can't let this spirit control us. We need to understand it, find its weakness. Compliance might buy time, but it won't end the nightmare." The room erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in despair. The fractures within the community deepened, old friendships strained under the weight of impossible choices. Later, Thomas found himself alone at the edge of the cornfield, the whispering stalks swaying gently in the cool night breeze. The voices were clearer now, urgent and pleading. He closed his eyes, feeling the burden of his ancestors' sins pressing down on him. Could he break the cycle, or was the village doomed to repeat this gruesome ritual? Back in his office, Sheriff Crow stared out the window, the weight of helplessness heavy upon him. The laws he upheld were powerless here, caught between the tangible and the spectral. He clenched his fists, knowing the coming days would test every ounce of his resolve and the fragile fabric of their community. As the night deepened, the village of Harrow's End stood at a crossroads. The journal's secret had unveiled the terrible truth, and the villagers faced a harrowing choice: submit to the spirit's demands and perpetuate the cycle of blood, or rise in resistance and risk utter destruction. The whispers in the fields carried on, a chilling reminder that the darkness was far from over. And so, beneath the cold gaze of a harvest moon, the village held its breath, waiting for the inevitable reckoning that would decide their fate. The evening air was thick with unease as Thomas Grady stood in the small, worn kitchen of the family farmhouse. The faint glow of the stove fire cast flickering shadows across the faded wallpaper and the faces of the two brothers. Across from him, Eli's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and frustration, the tension between them palpable. "You don't understand, Thomas," Eli said, voice trembling. "I've seen things, heard things in the fields. The whispers aren't just wind. They're warnings." Thomas shook his head, the lines of worry deepening on his weathered face. "Eli, you're letting fear cloud your judgment. We're farmers, not fools, chasing ghosts. There has to be a logical explanation." "Logical? What about the disappearances, the screams? Sarah Pike lost her sister last week, and now her husband's gone. That's not logic, Thomas. That's something else, something dark." The room was silent for a long moment, save for the distant rustling of the cornfields beyond the window. Thomas looked out, the stalks swaying gently as if alive, whispering secrets he was only beginning to understand. "I've always dismissed those old stories," he admitted quietly. "But maybe there's truth in them after all." Eli's expression softened, but the fear lingered. "If we don't believe, if we don't act, more people will be lost." Meanwhile, just a few houses down the lane, Sarah Pike stood in the village cemetery, rain mingling with tears as she knelt beside a freshly turned grave. The earth was dark and damp, the scent of rain-soaked soil heavy in the air. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the mound, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I don't know how to fight this," she whispered to herself, voice breaking, "but I can't lose anyone else." Back in the village hall, a tense meeting was underway. Villagers packed the room, their faces etched with worry and disbelief. Thomas stood before them, the weight of his newfound conviction pressing down on him. "The whispers in the cornfields are real," he said, voice steady despite the knot of dread in his stomach. "They demand a sacrifice. This isn't superstition anymore, it's a curse, and it's killing us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, others fearful. Sheriff Daniel Crow sat rigidly at the edge of the room, his pragmatic demeanor clashing with the growing hysteria. "We need to stay calm and stick to what we know," the sheriff said firmly. "Fear won't save anyone." But Thomas could see the doubt flickering in his eyes, the same doubt that gnawed at him relentlessly. Later that night, Thomas wandered alone along the border of the cornfields. The stalks rustled with a voice that was no longer just the wind. It was a chorus of whispers, urgent and chilling, weaving through the air like a living thing. He stopped, heart pounding, and listened. The words were indistinct, but filled with menace, a dark promise of demands yet unmet. "What have we done to deserve this?" Thomas whispered into the night, the dread settling deep in his bones. As the whispers grew louder, Thomas realized the truth he had been resisting. The curse was real, and it was only beginning to tighten its grip on Harrow's end. The fragile bonds of family and community were fraying, and the choices ahead would test every ounce of courage he had left. The night pressed on, thick with shadows and the restless voices of the fields. Thomas knew the battle for his village's soul was just beginning, and there was no turning back. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the village of Harrow's End. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the restless rustling of the cornfields that bordered the settlement like watchful sentinels. Tonight, the villagers gathered in the central clearing, not with the usual festive cheer of the harvest festival, but with grim faces and whispered prayers. The time for appeasement had come. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the crowd, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading light. His sharp blue eyes scanned the faces assembled before him, faces etched with fear, determination, and a desperate hope that this ritual would end the nightmare that had gripped their home. Beside him, Maggie Ellis clutched the worn journal, her auburn hair tangled and her expression taut with worry. Sheriff Daniel Crow, ever the pragmatist, paced silently, the weight of his hat a small comfort against the growing dread. The chosen sacrifice, a young man whose name was now lost amid the murmurs, was laid upon a hastily constructed altar carved from ancient wood and entwined with withering cornstalks. The air was thick with the metallic temps of fresh blood, a grim offering to the malevolent spirit that had haunted the fields for generations. Eli Grady, Thomas's younger brother, stood nearby, his eyes wide with terror but resigned, whispering prayers to voices only he seemed to hear. As the ritual commenced, Thomas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The cornfields at the clearing's edge began to stir unnaturally, the stalks swaying though the wind had died to a breathless hush. A low murmur rose, a sinister chorus of whispers that grew in volume and intensity until it filled the clearing like a suffocating fog. Then, without warning, the whispers twisted into anguished screams, ripping through the night with a ferocity that chilled every soul present. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the shadows lengthened, coalescing into shifting forms that flickered like flame against the dark. Panic erupted as the cornfields seemed to come alive, stalks bending and snapping as if possessed by some ravenous hunger. Fences were torn asunder. Homes shuddered under the onslaught of this unnatural storm. The villagers scattered, screams piercing the night as the fields claimed another victim, dragging them screaming into the darkness. Thomas acted on instinct, grabbing Maggie's arm and pulling her to safety behind a shattered fence post. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the roar of the wind and the crackling destruction. But escape was no easy task. The cornfields twisted and shifted, closing in like a living maze designed to trap them forever. Sheriff Crow barked orders, attempting to rally the frightened villagers, but even his voice was swallowed by the chaos. Sarah Pike's terrified cries echoed as she was separated from her family, her form swallowed by the relentless green tide. Thomas's heart pounded wildly as he searched for her, his mind flashing to the countless others who had vanished without trace. As dawn finally broke, the violent uproar subsided, leaving behind a devastated village shrouded in an eerie, suffocating silence. The fields, once vibrant and teeming with life, now stood still, their whispers stilled, but the shadow of menace lingering like a suffocating fog. Survivors huddled amidst the ruins, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief and sorrow. More bodies were missing, more families shattered. Thomas sank to his knees beside the altar, the bloodied wood, a grim reminder of their failure. The journal lay open in Maggie's trembling hands, its cryptic passages suddenly more urgent and terrifying than ever. The harvest spirit's demands had escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. No longer content with symbolic offerings, it sought a deeper, darker price. "It's not just a curse," Thomas whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "It's a hunger, and it's growing." Maggie nodded, tears streaking down her dirt-smudged face. "We have to find another way, before it's too late." But even as they spoke, the distant rustling of the cornfields whispered a chilling reminder. The darkness was far from done. The failed offering was not the end, but a terrifying beginning, and the price of survival would only grow higher from here, as the villagers began to pick through the wreckage of their homes and lives. An uneasy truth settled over Harrow's End, one that would haunt them long after the night's horrors faded. The harvest spirit was ancient, relentless, and hungry, and this time it was clear that appeasement through blood alone would not satisfy its dark appetite. Thomas stood, wiping the grime and blood from his hands. His gaze drifted toward the silent fields, where the stalks swayed gently in the morning breeze, as if mocking their defeat. The whispers had ceased, but their absence was not a comfort, it was a warning. In the depths of his heart, Thomas knew that the battle for Harrow's End was far from over. The spirit's hunger had only grown, and with it, the shadows that clung to the fields like a suffocating shroud. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The village needed a savior, and whether he liked it or not, that savior would have to be him. With the rising sun casting long fingers of light across the broken ground, Thomas Grady set his jaw and stepped forward into the heart of darkness that awaited. The night air in Harrow's End hung heavy with a tension that seemed to seep into the very soil, thick and suffocating. It was a night unlike any other, one where the familiar rhythms of rural life had been shattered, replaced by something raw and volatile. The village square, usually a place of quiet communion and celebration during harvest time, had transformed into a battleground of accusations and mistrust. Lantern light flickered against the faces of the villagers, casting long, jittery shadows that danced in time with their rising voices. Heated arguments erupted like wildfire, fueled by fear and the growing desperation that clung to every whispered word. "It's them," one woman spat, pointing a trembling finger at her neighbor. "They're hiding secrets, feeding the curse." Broken glass tinkled as a jar was hurled across the square, shattering on the dusty ground. The sharp sound seemed to ignite the crowd further, voices rising into a cacophony of fear and rage. Amidst the chaos, Sheriff Daniel Crow stepped forward, his form solid and unyielding like a bastion against the storm. His weather-beaten face bore the lines of years spent trying to impose order, and tonight was no different. "Enough." Crow's voice cut through the din, rough and authoritative. "This fighting solves nothing. We have a curfew starting immediately," he declared, his eyes scanning the restless crowd. "Anyone caught roaming the streets after dark will be brought in. We need to keep the peace, if not for yourselves, then for the sake of the village." His words, meant to calm, only stoked the embers of suspicion. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd, but the sheriff's presence kept outright violence at before now. Yet, as the villagers dispersed under the heavy watch of lawmen, the fractures within the community were laid bare. Neighbors no longer spoke as friends, but as wary strangers eyeing each other with suspicion. Back inside the modest farmhouse that had sheltered generations of Gradys, Thomas Grady sat hunched over a worn wooden table. Candlelight flickered, casting a warm glow over the pages of the ancestral journal sprawled before him. Maggie Ellis leaned in close, her auburn hair catching the light, her eyes sharp and focused. The journal was a fragile thread to the past, a relic of secrets long buried beneath years of silence. Together, they traced the faded script, piecing together the origins of the curse that now threatened to consume their home. The words spoke of bargains struck with a spirit bound to the earth, a pact sealed with sacrifice and blood. Outside, the wind whispered through the cornfields, carrying with it that chilling susurration, the voices that had haunted their nights. It was a reminder that the darkness beyond their walls was patient, watching, waiting. Their quiet study was shattered by a sudden knock at the door. Eli Grady stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face drawn tight with anxiety. The tension between the brothers was palpable, a clash of belief and doubt simmering beneath their strained expressions. "Thomas," Eli began, voice rough, "you can't keep denying what's happening. The crops, the disappearances, it's real. You have to listen." His eyes searched Thomas's, pleading for understanding. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect you, Eli, but we can't let fear destroy us. We need a plan, not panic." The exchange cracked open old wounds, their words sharp as the night air. The brothers stood divided, the weight of their legacy pressing down on them both. Outside, the corn whispered secrets, indifferent to human strife. As the village grappled with its breaking points, Thomas and Maggie fortified their resolve. They knew that beyond the fractures and fear lay a choice, one that would demand courage and sacrifice. The harvest was far from over, and the shadows that crept through the stalks were hungry for more than just grain. The night deepened, and with it, the sense that the worst was yet to come. The fields held their breath, the whispers growing louder, as if calling out to something dark and relentless. Thomas closed the journal and met Maggie's steady gaze. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. "If we're going to end this, we need to be ready." Maggie nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever it takes." Beyond the walls, the wind carried a sinister promise, and the village of Harrow's End teetered on the edge of a darkness that threatened to consume them all. But even in the depths of despair, a fragile ember of hope smoldered, waiting for the moment to ignite. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of the whispering corn, the battle for the soul of the village was just beginning. The sky was bruised with the last light of day as Thomas Grady stepped silently into the oldest cornfield, the stalks towering like sentinels around him. Each step stirred a whisper, a susurration of voices weaving through the rustling leaves, intangible yet palpable in the cool evening air. The golden sea of corn rose in waves, bending and swaying with the wind that seemed to carry the murmurs of centuries past. Thomas's breath came steady, though his heart thudded with a mixture of dread and grim resolve. The village behind him was now a distant memory, swallowed by the growing shadows and the relentless chorus of the whispering crops. He recalled the stories old man Harrow had spoken in fragmented riddles. A pact forged in desperation, a covenant sealed with blood to ensure the village's survival. The weight of his ancestors' sins pressed heavily upon his shoulders, but he could no longer deny the truth lurking beneath the soil. Tonight, he would confront the malevolent force that had twisted the land into a harbinger of death. Deeper into the labyrinth of stalks he ventured, guided by the faint glow of the rising moon and the increasingly urgent whispers that seemed to beckon him forward. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Thomas's skin prickled as shadows morphed and flickered at the edges of his vision, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurring. At last, he reached a small clearing, hidden from prying eyes by a ring of ancient oaks whose gnarled roots clawed into the earth like skeletal hands. In the center stood a stone altar, worn and cracked but ominously intact. Twisted vines and roots clung to its sides, stained dark with fresh blood that seeped into the soil below. The whispers escalated into a haunting chant, a chorus of voices layered with desperation and hunger. Thomas's gaze dropped to the altar, his stomach twisting with revulsion and understanding. This was the heart of the curse, the focal point of the sacrificial rites that had fed the harvest spirit for generations. The spirit itself now stirred, coalescing from the shadows and mist that danced among the corn. It took no fixed form, shifting fluidly between vague humanoid shapes and flickering tendrils of darkness, its presence overwhelming yet elusive. A voice, or rather many voices intertwined, whispered directly into Thomas's mind, carrying the weight of ancient wrath and insatiable hunger. The blood must flow, the spirit murmured, to feed the land, to keep the harvest bountiful. The pact is unbroken. Thomas swallowed his fear, gripping the rusted farming knife he had brought. His thoughts raced. Was he to become another victim, another sacrifice to appease the cursed soil? Or could he shatter the cycle that had bound his family and village for centuries? The spirit's whispers grew louder, pressing, demanding. "I will not be your pawn," Thomas declared, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This ends tonight." The spirit's form twisted in a swirl of shadows, the air thickening with a chill that seeped into his bones. Yet within Thomas burned a fierce defiance, a determination forged from love for his community and the burden of legacy. As stars blinked coldly above, Thomas prepared to face the darkness, knowing that the path ahead would demand sacrifices beyond reckoning. The whispering cornfields held their breath, waiting for the outcome of this desperate confrontation. And beneath the moon's watchful eye, the harvest of shadows began. The night had swallowed Harrow's end whole, leaving only the faint rustle of corn stalks to fill the vast silence. Thomas Grady stepped cautiously into the heart of the oldest cornfield, the moonlight casting long, flickering shadows that danced like specters between the towering stalks. Each breath he took felt thick, heavy with the damp earth and the sharp tang of something ancient and terrible lurking beneath the soil. Whispers slithered through the corn, faint at first, like the murmur of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. But as Thomas advanced, they grew louder, more insistent voices that clawed at the edges of his sanity. They called his name, pleaded, threatened, weaving a tapestry of dread that wrapped tight around his chest. The harvest spirit was near. His fingers brushed against the cold, weathered stone half buried beneath twisted roots and wilted vines, the sacrificial altar. Stains of crimson marred its cracked surface, fresh and glistening under the moon's pale gaze. The pact his ancestors had forged so long ago, binding the land to blood and sacrifice, pulsed with a malignant life. Thomas's heart hammered, each beat echoing the weight of generations. He had spent weeks unraveling the secrets, wrestling with disbelief and fear. Now, faced with the spirit itself, the reality was undeniable. The crops would not yield without a price paid in human blood, and that price demanded a sacrifice. "You know why you're here, Thomas Grady," the voice whispered, serpentine and cold. The shadows around the altar shifted, coalescing into a vague humanoid form, its eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly hunger. The cycle must continue. One must fall so many may live. He swallowed hard, the taste of earth and iron filling his mouth. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why must I be the one?" The harvest spirit's form rippled like smoke, the voice now a chorus of tormented souls bound to the soil. "Your blood carries the legacy. The pact binds you as it binds the land. To break it is to invite ruin." Memories surged unbidden, his father's stern warnings, Old Man Harrow's cryptic tales, Maggie's desperate hope. He thought of the village, the frightened faces, the empty homes, the whispers of those lost to the fields. And of Eli, his brother, whose faith in the old stories had driven them apart. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine as the whispers crescendoed into anguished screams, the cornfield trembling as if alive. The spirit demanded an answer. His thoughts fractured, torn between duty and survival, between sacrifice and rebellion. Could he offer himself to save the village, perpetuating a curse written in blood? Or could he defy the ancient covenant, risking annihilation but striving to free Harrow's end from its dark legacy? Suddenly, Maggie's voice broke through the storm of despair, clear and resolute in his mind. "There has to be another way, Thomas. We found the journal. We have the knowledge. You don't have to face this alone." He closed his eyes, drawing on her strength, the warmth of her belief amidst the cold shadows. The whispers faltered, as if sensing his wavering resolve. Opening his eyes, Thomas stepped closer to the altar, the night air thick with tension. The harvest spirit's gaze bore into him, waiting. "I will not let this curse define us," Thomas declared, voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I choose to end this no matter the cost." The shadows writhed, the whispers twisting into a furious roar. The ground shook beneath his feet, and the air grew electric with ancient power. Thomas felt the pulse of the land, the hunger of the soil, and the weight of his ancestors crushing down. Then, silence. The cornfields stilled. The harvest spirit's form dissolved into the mist, leaving only the faintest echo of a whisper, a promise or a threat yet to be understood. Thomas sank to his knees, breath ragged but spirit unbroken. The choice he had made would shape the fate of Harrow's end forever. The dawn was still hours away, and the shadows had not yet fully retreated. But, for the first time, hope flickered in the darkness, fragile, trembling light against the vast night. He would fight for his village. He would confront the legacy of blood and shadow. And whatever came next, he would face it with open eyes and a steadfast heart. As Thomas rose, the first faint hints of dawn brushed the horizon, casting a pale glow over the silent fields. The whispers had ceased, but their memory lingered, a haunting reminder that the harvest was far from over. The sky hung heavy and grey over Harrow's End as dawn broke on the day following the sacrifice. Thomas Grady stood alone in the heart of the oldest cornfield, the stalks around him bent and broken, trampled underfoot in the chaos of the night before. The sacrificial altar, a crude stone slab entwined with ancient symbols, lay empty now, its surface stained dark with fresh blood that had seeped deep into the soil. An oppressive silence weighed down the air, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves stirred by a cold, lifeless breeze. Thomas's breath came ragged, his chest tight with exhaustion and grief. Around him, the whispers that had haunted the village for weeks had finally ceased, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The price had been paid, a sacrifice so profound that it had torn through the very fabric of the community. He lowered his gaze to the bloodied ground, the red stains a stark reminder of the horror endured, and the burden now carried by all who remained. Back in the village hall, a gathering of survivors huddled together in the dim morning light. Faces once alight with festival joy were now drawn and pale, etched with sorrow and fatigue. Maggie Ellis moved quietly among them, her gentle hands offering herbal teas and remedies meant to soothe trembling nerves and aching hearts. Her auburn hair caught the weak sunlight filtering through the cracked windows, and her kind eyes shone with both compassion and a fragile hope. Despite the overwhelming grief, she remained a pillar of strength, her knowledge of the old law offering a slender thread of comfort to those willing to grasp it. The hall was heavy with unspoken words and shared pain. Some sat in silence, staring blankly ahead, while others whispered prayers or clutched remnants of loved ones lost. The air was thick with the scent of earth, sweat, and smoke, a ghost of the rituals that had unfolded in the fields just hours before. Outside, faint echoes of the past seemed to linger, a sigh of wind through the broken stalks, a distant creak of a shutter, the soft murmur of a forgotten curse. Sheriff Daniel Crow patrolled the village streets at twilight, his sturdy frame casting long, distorted shadows beneath the flickering lanterns. His weather-beaten face was etched with lines of worry and weariness, and his usually gruff demeanor was softened by the weight of helplessness. He had done all he could to maintain order as panic had gripped the town, but the events had surpassed any law he could enforce. Now, he walked silently, the empty streets a stark reminder of the lives shattered and the community fractured. Each step echoed in the quiet, his hand resting near the holster, more out of habit than hope. The law had limits here, against ancient pacts, restless spirits, and the primal hunger of the land itself. Crow's mind wrestled with the futility of his role, yet he remained resolute. Protection meant more than enforcing rules. It meant standing guard in the face of a darkness that no badge could contain. Meanwhile, on the porch of the Grady farm, Eli Grady sat hunched against the chill evening air, his gaze fixed on the darkened expanse of the cornfields that loomed like silent sentinels beyond the yard. His hands trembled as he clutched a worn wooden cross, murmuring prayers in a voice barely above a whisper. The loss of friends, family, and the innocence of the village weighed heavily on him, his youthful faith shaken but clinging desperately to hope. Eli's eyes reflected the flickering light of a nearby lantern, haunted and wide, as memories of the nightmare danced behind his lids. The whispered voices, the screams, the final moments of sacrifice, these would not simply fade. They were etched into the soil, into the air, into the very essence of the land he had known all his life. The future was uncertain, shadowed by fear, but somewhere deep within, a fragile spark of resilience flickered. Thomas returned to the village just as night fell, his form silhouetted against the dying light. Faces turned toward him, a mixture of relief, suspicion, and sorrow. The villagers saw in him both the burden bearer and the man changed irrevocably by the horror he had faced. Words were scarce. None could capture the depth of what had transpired. Instead, they shared glances heavy with understanding and loss. That night, the cornfields lay quiet. The once relentless whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie calm that unsettled even the most stoic. The darkness had receded, but none dared believe it was vanquished. Thomas stood at the edge of the fields, listening intently to the silence, feeling the weight of the ancestral curse that had been momentarily stilled but never truly broken. As the village drifted toward a restless sleep, the wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper. It was a sound not of reassurance, but of warning, a reminder that the harvest spirit's hunger remained patient, eternal, and waiting for the next cycle to begin. The scars of the harvest would never fully heal. The shadows within the cornfields held their secrets close, and the people of Harrow's End would forever carry the price of the whispers in their hearts. But amidst the dread and despair, a seed of hope endured, fragile, like the first green shoot breaking through the scorched earth after a storm, promising that perhaps, one day, the village might rise anew from the harvest of shadows. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the cornfields that surrounded Harrow's End. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the fields were quiet. No whispers rustled through the stalks, no eerie voices floated on the wind. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of his land, hands deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes scanning the unmoving sea of corn. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy. Relief battled unease in his chest. The village was alive. The missing, unaccounted for, but at least no new horrors had claimed more victims in recent days. Yet the oppressive stillness clung like a shroud. Behind him, the village stirred awake. The scars of the recent horrors were etched deep into the faces of Harrow's End's survivors. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted with an urgency born of fear, but life persisted. Thomas turned away from the fields and made his way toward the town square, where the faint sounds of morning routines began to creep in. The clatter of pots, murmurs of cautious conversations, and the distant crow of a rooster. The harvest festival had long ended, but the shadow it cast remained. Inside a modest home near the center of the village, Maggie Ellis sat at a wooden table strewn with notes and the worn, leather-bound ancestral journal. The flickering candlelight illuminated her auburn hair, and the steady determination etched into her features. She traced the faded ink of the pact made generations ago, the grim covenant with the land that demanded a terrible price. Though the whispers had ceased, Maggie knew that the cost of survival was far from over. The journal held secrets, hints at rituals that could protect the village without feeding the malevolent spirit. But the path was uncertain, and the sacrifices already made weighed heavily on her heart. Thomas entered, his boots creaking softly on the wooden floor. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of shared grief and resolve passing between them. "We can't let our guard down," Maggie said quietly, closing the journal. "The silence feels wrong, like it's holding its breath. We survived this storm, but the clouds haven't fully cleared." Thomas nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. But what else can we do? We're still here. The fields are still standing. Maybe the worst is behind us." Maggie's gaze flickered with a mixture of hope and doubt. "Maybe, but I'm going to keep searching. There has to be a way to end this, not just survive it." Outside, the village gathered cautiously for a meeting in the community hall. The room was filled with weary faces marked by loss and sleepless nights. Sheriff Daniel Crow stood near the doorway, his weather-beaten face tight with concern but softened by the sight of familiar neighbors. Sarah Pike sat quietly in a corner, exhaustion and grief shadowing her usually steady demeanor. The community was fragile, a tapestry of fear and tentative hope. Thomas addressed the group, his voice steady but tinged with fatigue. "We've been through hell, and I know the silence feels like a reprieve, but we have to be ready. This land, This curse, it's part of our history now. We're tied to it, whether we like it or not. We need to rebuild, to watch over each other, and to stay vigilant." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Plans were made to reinforce patrols around the fields, to share information, and to support those who had lost loved ones. The village was determined to reclaim its peace, but the scars ran deep. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Sarah Pike walked the edge of the village. The cold air bit at her skin, her breath a steady plume in the darkness. The fields stretched endlessly before her, silent and still. Suddenly, a faint rustle stirred the silence. Her heart jumped, muscles tensing as she scanned the shadows. But there was nothing, only the gentle sway of corn under a whispering breeze that wasn't really whispering at all. She exhaled slowly, a fragile hope settling in her chest, tempered by the lingering fear that the darkness was merely sleeping, waiting for its next moment to awaken. Back at the Grady farm, Thomas stood once more at the field's edge, gazing into the silent rows. The weight of his ancestors' choices pressed down on him. He had survived, but the cost was etched in every lost neighbor, every shattered family. The harvest of shadows had passed for now. But the uneasy peace reminded him that some darkness never truly dies. It waits, patient and hungry, beneath the surface. As the village slept, Thomas's thoughts drifted to the future. He would keep watch. He would protect his people. And if the whispers returned, he would be ready. For in Harrow's end, the land held its secrets tight, and the shadows were never truly gone. The air inside Old Man Harrow's study was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a tangible weight pressing down on Thomas as he stepped across the creaking wooden floor. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, where shelves sagged under the burden of ancient tomes and brittle parchments. Harrow sat hunched behind a battered desk, his gnarled hands clasped tightly, eyes like storm clouds reflecting years of burden. "You must understand," Harrow began, his voice low and gravelly, "this pact we made. It was never meant to be broken, not truly. Our ancestors bargained with forces older than the land itself. The harvest spirit is bound to the soil, to the blood spilled in its name. Even if the sacrifices stop, the hunger doesn't die. It waits, it watches." Thomas felt a cold shiver trace his spine. The old man's words were not mere superstition. They were a somber truth carved into the very roots of Harrow's end. He glanced to Maggie, seated quietly nearby, her face drawn but resolute. "So, what then?" Thomas asked, voice rough with disbelief, yet tinged with a desperate hope. "Is there no end to this? No way to finally set things right?" Harrow shook his head slowly. "The darkness is patient. It ebbs, but it never leaves. We can only hold it at bay, honor the land carefully, and never forget what was sacrificed to reap its bounty." The weight of the past settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders as he left the study, stepping out into the chill of dusk. The cornfields stretched before him, their stalks silent and still under the fading blood-red sky. The usual whispering was absent, replaced by a haunting quiet that felt more menacing than any sound. He moved to the edge of the field, fingers brushing against the dry husks. The pact's shadow lingered here, an invisible presence pressing against his skin, reminding him of the cost that had been paid and the price yet to come. It was not just a memory, it was a warning. Back in the village, the community gathered in Maggie's small kitchen, the hearth's warm glow contrasting the chill outside. Faces were etched with exhaustion and grief. The recent losses had hollowed the spirit of Harrow's end. Murmurs of fear and uncertainty filled the room. But beneath the despair was a glimmer of unity. Maggie met Thomas's gaze across the circle, her eyes steady. They shared an understanding. Despite the darkness that had descended, they would endure. They must. That night, Thomas sat alone on his porch, the wind carrying faint whispers across the barren fields. Though silent, the atmosphere was heavy with an unseen presence, as if the land itself held its breath. He knew the harvest spirit was not gone, it was merely waiting, patient and hungry. With a deep breath, Thomas resolved to remain vigilant. The pact's legacy was an echo that would never fade. A shadow cast long over Harrow's end, but as long as he stood watch, he would fight to protect what remained of his home. The whispers might return. The darkness might rise again. But so would the village scarred, fearful yet unbroken. And with that fragile hope, the night closed in once more over the silent fields. The sun dipped low over Harrow's end, casting the last golden rays through the skeletal remains of the cornfields. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the withering stalks, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily against his chest. The air was thick with the scent of dried earth and fallen leaves, a stark reminder of the harvest that had come with such a terrible price. His breath formed faint clouds in the cooling evening as he waited, the anticipation knotting in his stomach. Eli appeared from the shadow of a weathered fence, his steps hesitant. The younger brother's pale face was drawn tight, eyes flickering with a mix of fear and stubborn resolve. "Thomas," Eli said quietly, voice barely above the whisper of the dying fields. "I didn't think you'd come." Thomas offered a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But we need to talk." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy and charged. The rift that had formed between them was deeper than either wanted to admit, a divide carved by belief and doubt, by the horrors they'd witnessed and the truths they refused to face in the same way. "I know you don't believe," Eli began, voice trembling, "but I've seen what the fields can do. The whispers, the disappearances. It's real, Thomas." Thomas looked away, jaw clenched. "I believe in what I can see and touch," he said. "That's what I've always believed. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's more to this than I wanted to accept." Eli's eyes softened. "We're both scared. That's all this fight is about." The brothers' conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Maggie Ellis emerged from the path, her auburn hair catching the last light, her steady gaze lending a calm that both men needed. "I'm glad you're talking," she said gently. "The village needs that, people coming together instead of tearing apart." Inside Maggie's small kitchen, a fire crackled in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the worn walls. She had invited a handful of villagers who, like her, hoped for a way forward beyond fear and suspicion. The heavy journal lay open on the table, its ancient script a beacon amidst the darkness. "The pact is broken," Maggie explained to the group, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But the legacy remains. We have to understand it if we want to heal." The villagers listened, some nodding slowly, others exchanging doubtful glances. The pain was fresh, and trust was fragile. "We can't forget what happened," Sarah Pike said softly, her voice breaking. "But maybe we can learn from it." Outside, the village wore its scars like a shroud. Boarded windows stood as silent sentinels to loss. Abandoned homes whispered of vanished families, and the streets echoed with memories too painful to voice aloud. Thomas walked through the ghostly stillness, each step a reminder of battles fought and lives forever changed. Later, in the dim light of the community hall, a meeting was called. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken grievances. Old resentments flared as neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. the trauma having split the village along fragile fault lines. "We have to find a way to move forward," Thomas urged, his voice rising above the murmur. "Together." But the path to unity was fraught with obstacles. Voices rose in argument, some accusing others of cowardice or complicity. Yet beneath the discord, a fragile hope took root, a shared desire for healing, however distant it might seem. As the meeting adjourned, Thomas stood by the door, watching the villagers drift away into the night. The fractured bonds of Harrow's End would take time to mend, but in the quiet determination of a few, there was a promise that the darkness might one day be held at bay. He turned toward the fields once more, the whisper of the wind through the stalks carrying both warning and hope. The harvest had ended, but the struggle for the village's soul was far from over. "We'll find a way," Thomas whispered to the shadows, "or we'll fall trying." And with that, he stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The evening air hung heavy with a creeping chill, the kind that seeped into bones and whispered secrets in the rustling of dying leaves. Thomas Grady stood at the boundary where the village gave way to the endless sea of cornfields, those tall stalks that had sustained Harrow's End for generations. Tonight, however, the fields seemed different, alive, with a sound that was not quite wind, not quite the rustling of dry leaves. A whisper, faint and fragile, tugged at the edges of Thomas's consciousness. He squinted into the dying light, the sky a bruised purple above the waving gold. The whispers were there, soft as a breath, threading through the stalks like a secret only the fields dared to tell. Thomas's heart thudded low and heavy in his chest. After months of silence, the voices had returned. The village had tried to move on. After the devastating sacrifice that had scarred their community, the fields had fallen silent, the oppressive dread lifting like fog at dawn. But the silence had felt fragile, a thin veneer over something far older and darker. Thomas's jaw clenched as he listened. The whispers were not just a memory, they were a warning. Back in the village hall, the air was thick with unease. Maggie Ellis sat across from Thomas, her auburn hair catching the flicker of candlelight as she flipped through the tattered pages of the ancestral journal. Sheriff Daniel Crow leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his usual stern expression softened by worry. Eli Grady sat tense at the far end of the table, his restless eyes darting between the adults who carried the weight of their shared past. "The whispers," Maggie said quietly, "they're back. Not loud, but they're there. The land is stirring again." Sheriff Crow shook his head. "You expect me to believe the crops are talking? After everything, Thomas, maybe it's just the wind playing tricks." Thomas held the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I wish that were true, but after what we've seen, I can't ignore it." Eli spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "I told you, they never left. They're waiting, hungry. We just made it quiet for a while." The room fell silent, the weight of Eli's words sinking in. The harvest spirit's hunger was not sated. It was patient, eternal. Later, Maggie wandered the quiet streets, the village bathed in moonlight and the soft glow of scattered lanterns. Her footsteps were hushed against the earth, but the night was alive with the faintest murmur from the fields beyond. She paused, breath catching in her throat as the whispers swirled around her like smoke. Memories of the past, of terror and sacrifice, rose unbidden. She clenched her fists, resolve hardening. They had survived once, they could survive again. Meanwhile, Thomas knelt in a freshly harvested patch of earth, fingers sifting through the loose soil. The wind stirred, carrying that haunting sound once more, a sibilant lullaby of something ancient and hungry. He closed his eyes, the burden of legacy pressing down, but beneath it, a fragile spark of hope. The curse was not ended, but the village would not fall without a fight. As night deepened, the whispers wove through the fields, a chilling promise that the harvest spirit endured. And Thomas, standing watch beneath the stars, vowed to confront whatever darkness lay ahead. The shadows may return, but so too would the courage to stand against them. The fragile silence was broken once more, and with it, the fate of Harrow's End hung trembling on the edge of a blade. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor of Thomas Grady's study, its fading light filtering through curtains heavy with dust and the scent of old paper. His fingers trembled slightly as they turned another fragile page of the ancient journal. Maggie had found weeks before a journal that seemed to hold the key to understanding the terrible legacy that now suffocated Harrow's End. The room was silent except for the faint scratch of his pen marking notes on a fresh sheet of yellowed parchment and the creak of the settling farmhouse. Outside, the cornfields whispered softly in the evening breeze, their voices a constant, haunting reminder of the pact that had bound the village for centuries. Thomas had spent countless nights walking those fields, listening intently, trying to decipher the restless murmurs that had once seemed like mere superstition but now bore the weight of deadly truth. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he reflected on the burden his ancestors had passed down, a covenant sworn in desperation and sealed with blood. The ancestral pact, a secret buried beneath generations of silence, demanded a price that no farming community could ever truly afford. Yet the land had thrived, its bounty unnatural in its abundance, sustained by sacrifices that twisted the very soul of Harrow's End. Maggie's voice broke the heavy quiet, soft but urgent. "Thomas, look here." She pointed to a passage written in spidery script, dense with cryptic symbols and archaic language. This part, it speaks of the cycle. The spirit does not merely demand sacrifice, it feeds on the fear and obedience of the villagers. It's bound to their belief as much as to the blood. Thomas furrowed his brow, tracing the words with a finger. So, it's not just about the sacrifice itself. It's about the legacy, the fear we carry, the stories we tell ourselves, the silence we keep. Maggie nodded. We have to break that. We have to change the story, or this will never end. Their resolve was tempered by the cold understanding that the darkness was ancient, patient, and cunning. It had survived centuries of whispered warnings and forgotten curses. Yet in this knowledge lay a fragile hope. By uncovering and confronting the truth, they might sever the chains of the past. That evening, Old Man Harrow arrived, his presence as weathered and enduring as the land itself. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, held a solemnity that spoke of countless seasons spent guarding the village's secrets. The pact was made in desperation, he rasped, voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Our forebears chose survival over innocence, and the land accepted their bargain. But the cost is never truly paid. Thomas listened, the weight of the elder's words pressing down like the oppressive summer heat. Is there any way to undo it? To end this without more bloodshed? Old Man Harrow's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the last light clung to the edges of the restless cornfields. There are ways, he admitted quietly, but each path demands sacrifice in its own way. The choice is never simple, and the darkness does not easily relinquish its hold. As night deepened, Thomas stood alone at the edge of the cornfield, the tall stalks swaying silently beneath a starlit sky. The whispers had ceased for the moment, leaving an eerie stillness that settled over the earth like a shroud. Clutching his journal close, Thomas felt the dual weight of dread and duty. The legacy of shadows would follow him and those who came after, an unending vigilance to guard against the encroaching darkness. Yet, in the silence, there flickered a fragile spark of hope. By naming the curse, by recording its truths, Thomas had taken the first step toward breaking the cycle. The story of Harrow's end would no longer be one of quiet fear, but a warning etched into the pages of history. But as the wind stirred the corn once more, faint whispers returned, soft, persistent, and hungrier, reminding Thomas that some shadows never fully disappear. The harvest of shadows was not yet over. With a steady breath, Thomas turned from the field and walked back toward the village. The path ahead, uncertain, but the burden he bore now shared in ink and memory. He would keep watch. He would tell the story. And if the darkness stirred again, Harrow's end would be ready. The morning sun cast a pale light over Harrow's End, illuminating a village slowly stirring from its long nightmare. The streets, once eerily silent, now echoed with the familiar sounds of hammers striking nails, the creak of wagons laden with supplies, and the murmur of voices, tentative yet determined. Scattered piles of debris lay where homes had been scarred by the restless harvest spirit's wrath. But the people moved with purpose, their hands steady despite trembling hearts. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the village square, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Weathered faces, some worn with grief, others marked by relief, passed by as they carried timber or fetched water. His lean frame tensed with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The cost had been heavy, but the community's will to endure burned brighter than the flickering lanterns that still dotted the streets in the twilight hours. Beside him, Maggie Ellis adjusted the brim of her worn hat, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how the village feels both the same and different. Like the land remembers what happened, and so do we." Thomas nodded, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "We can't forget. We owe it to those we lost. But we also have to keep living." The harvest festival was tentatively planned for the coming week, sir. Fragile symbol of defiance against the darkness that had shadowed their lives. This time, the festival would be quieter, marked by remembrance rather than celebration. The villagers had agreed to honor the past sacrifices with simple rituals, flowers, and quiet prayers, rather than the old offerings that had once fed the land's cursed hunger. In the church, a meeting gathered the village's remaining leaders. Sheriff Daniel Crow, his stocky frame filling the pulpit, spoke with a voice roughened by years of command and recent strain. "We've seen what fear can do," he said, "how it can divide us. But it's time to bind ourselves together again. We must watch the fields, watch each other, and never let the shadows take hold like before." Old Man Harrow, stooped and cryptic as ever, added in his gravelly tone, "The pact is not easily broken. The land remembers, but so do we. Let our memories be our shield." The villagers listened quietly, the room thick with unspoken fears and a cautious hope. Among them, Sarah Pike wiped tears from her cheeks, her grief still raw but tempered by the community's solidarity. Outside, Eli Grady lingered near a cluster of rebuilding homes. His youthful face showed the weight of superstition, but also a growing understanding. He caught Thomas's eye and nodded, a silent truce between skepticism and belief. As dusk fell, lanterns were hung along the main street, casting a warm glow that pushed back the encroaching shadows. At the village square, a simple altar was erected, adorned with wild flowers, corn husks, and candles flickering in the gentle breeze. The scent of fresh earth mingled with the faint smoke of wood fires, creating an atmosphere both solemn and sacred. Thomas stood beside Maggie, their hands almost touching as they surveyed the scene. "The fields are quiet tonight," he murmured, "but I don't think the darkness is gone." Maggie's smile was faint but steady. "Maybe not, but we're stronger now. We remember who we aren't, what we've survived." The festival would come, bringing with it memories both bitter and sweet. Harrow's End was reborn in the shadow of its past, its people bound by loss and hope alike. The whispers in the cornfields were silent for now, but the vigil would never end. Thomas knew this, and as he looked into the night sky, he steeled himself for whatever shadows the future might hold. For in the heart of the village, beneath the quiet celebration, the harvest of shadows continued an enduring legacy of sacrifice, resilience, and the fragile promise of dawn. The late afternoon sun cast a soft, golden haze over the fields of Harrow's End, bathing the corn in an almost sacred light. Thomas Grady and Maggie Ellis moved quietly through the tallest stalks, their footsteps muffled by the thick earth beneath. They knelt side by side in the oldest cornfield, the place where the land's dark heart beat strongest. With a worn piece of wood, Thomas carefully traced ancient symbols into the soil symbols he had painstakingly copied from the faded pages of the ancestral journal Maggie had uncovered. The ritual was simple in appearance, but heavy with meaning. A delicate balance between respect and defiance. The corn rustled softly around them, whispering secrets carried on the breeze. Thomas's sharp blue eyes scanned the horizon, ever watchful despite the ritual's calm. "We honor the land," Maggie whispered, her auburn hair catching the last light of day, "but we don't feed the darkness." Thomas nodded, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. For years, he had dismissed the old stories as superstition. Now, as he carved the symbols into the earth, he understood the fragile pact they were attempting to renew, a covenant to protect, not to sacrifice. Later, inside Maggie's modest farmhouse, the scent of herbal tea mingled with the flicker of candlelight. They sat at a worn wooden table, poring over the ancestral journal. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but the words carried the power to guide or doom them. Shadows danced across the walls as their voices dropped to hushed tones, each sentence weighed with solemnity. "There's a way to honor the land without blood," Maggie said, tracing a passage with her finger. "But it requires vigilance. Rituals, offerings, respect. We have to be consistent, or the spirit will demand more." Thomas clenched his jaw, the memory of vanished neighbors and whispered screams still fresh. "We'll do whatever it takes." As dusk settled over the village, the two moved to the outskirts, carrying small bundles of herbs, woven wheat stalks, and tokens of the earth's bounty. They placed each offering carefully near the cornfield's edge, their movements deliberate and reverent. Around them, the whispering cornfields seemed to quiet, as if listening intently. A cool breeze wound through the stalks, carrying a faint but unmistakable undertone of menace, a reminder that the harvest spirit was never far. Night crept over Harrow's End, cloaking the village in darkness. The usual sounds of nocturnal life were subdued, replaced by an eerie silence that held the breath of anticipation. Inside his farmhouse, Thomas stood by the window, eyes scanning the black horizon where cornfields swayed under a moonless sky. His fists clenched tightly, knuckles white. The burden of his ancestors weighed heavily on his shoulders, but beneath the dread burned a fragile ember of hope. Hope that, through knowledge, respect, and vigilance, they might finally break free from the cycle of sacrifice. "We're the guardians now," he murmured to himself, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his heart. "The land's watchers." Maggie joined him at the window, her presence a quiet comfort. and we won't let the darkness win." Outside, the corn whispered again, soft and low, neither threatening nor welcoming, but a reminder that the shadow of the harvest still lingered. The pact was not broken. Not yet. But in this moment, the village had taken its first true step toward reclaiming its future. The night stretched on, thick with tension and possibility. Somewhere deep in the fields, the harvest spirit stirred, sensing the shift. It was a game of shadows now, a delicate dance between man and nature, fear and hope, legacy and redemption. And as long as Thomas and Maggie stood watch, the people of Harrow's End might just survive the harvest of shadows. Yet the question remained, could rituals born from ancient knowledge truly safeguard the village without repeating the horrors of the past? Or was this fragile peace merely the calm before a storm yet to come? The wind whispered once more, carrying the answer away into the darkness. The first light of dawn filtered through the heavy mist that clung to the cornfields, casting a pale glow over the stalks that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the field, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. The silence around him was profound, broken only by the soft rustle of the leaves and the distant call of a lone bird. Yet beneath that quiet lay the weight of so much lost, the vanished villagers. The blood soaked into the soil, the heavy price that had been paid for the fleeting bounty of the harvest. Thomas's shoulders sagged slightly, burdened not just by the physical toil of years on the farm, but by the emotional weight of the sacrifices that had shaped his home. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the cool morning air that smelled faintly of earth and dew. Memories of the past weeks surged forward, the whispers that had first seemed like the wind, the escalating terror as neighbors disappeared one by one, the fiery debates at the village meetings, and the harrowing nights spent wrestling with the dark truth of the ancestral pact. How had it come to this? How had the land's gifts become so twisted, demanding blood in exchange for sustenance? These questions haunted him relentlessly. Turning away from the field, Thomas made his way back toward the heart of the village. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual morning bustle replaced by a somber stillness that settled over Harrow's End like a shroud. He passed by shuttered windows and empty doorways, reminders of the families torn apart by fear and loss. At the small farmhouse where Maggie Ellis lived, he paused before knocking firmly on the door. Within moments, Maggie opened the door, her auburn hair tousled from restless sleep, her kind eyes shadowed but resolute. She ushered him inside without a word, leading him to the worn wooden table where the ancestral journal lay open, its fragile pages illuminated by the flickering glow of a single candle. Together, they leaned over the faded script, searching for any glimmer of hope amidst the cryptic warnings and dark rituals chronicled by their forebears. "There has to be a way to lessen the curse," Maggie murmured, tracing a finger along a passage that spoke of alternative offerings of appeasement without destruction. "But it's so vague. We need more than half-truths and faded ink." Thomas nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. "Every time we think we understand, it slips further away. But we can't give up. Not now. Not after everything." The silence between them was thick with shared exhaustion and unspoken fears. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, a constant reminder that the harvest spirit was never far away. Later that day, Thomas found himself outside the village hall where Eli waited, pacing nervously. The younger brother's eyes were troubled, reflecting a mixture of fear and frustration that had grown between them in recent weeks. Their beliefs about the curse and its origins were worlds apart. Thomas, The rational skeptic turned reluctant believer. Eli, the superstitious soul, clinging to old legends with desperate hope. "Thomas, you can't keep shutting it all down," Eli pleaded, voice low but urgent. "The land, the spirited's angry. We have to listen." "I'm listening, Eli," Thomas replied evenly. "But we have to find a way through this without losing ourselves or each other. Sacrifice after sacrifice, it's tearing the village apart." Their words hung heavy between them, a fragile bridge over a widening gulf. The village depended on their unity, yet the strain of mistrust and grief threatened to unravel the bonds that had held Harrow's End together for generations. As night fell, Sheriff Daniel Crow took his usual patrol through the empty streets, his boots echoing against the cracked pavement. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down like the thick night air. Law and order seemed powerless against the unseen force that stalked the cornfields, whispering threats that no badge or weapon could silence. He paused at the edge of the village, staring into the darkened rows of corn where shadows shifted and danced. The harvest spirit was a menace beyond his understanding, a primal force that defied explanation or control. "We've done all we can," he muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the brim of his hat. Now it's up to Thomas and the others to find a way out of this darkness. Back in the farmhouse, Thomas sat alone long after Maggie had retired for the night. The journal lay closed on the table, its secrets seemingly out of reach. He thought of the faces lost, the sacrifices made, and the future that now seemed uncertain. Could there ever be redemption? Or was the price of survival a debt that Harrow's End would pay forever? Outside, a sudden breeze stirred the cornfields, and for a moment, the faintest whisper brushed against the window, a chilling reminder that the shadows were never truly gone, only waiting. Thomas's jaw clenched. He would not let the darkness win, not yet. Not while there was still breath in his body to fight for the village he loved, no matter the cost. And so, beneath the cold gaze of the moon, Harrow's End held its breath. Balanced between hope and despair, haunted by the past but determined to face whatever came next. The price of survival had never been Heroned. Thomas knew the hardest choices were still to come. The evening air hung heavy with a damp chill as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the golden sea of corn that stretched beyond the village of Harrow's End. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the fields, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes narrowing into the gathering dusk. The stalks rustled softly, whispering secrets only the land could understand, or perhaps only those cursed to listen. Beside him, Maggie Ellis shifted uneasily, her auburn hair catching the last glimmers of light. "Do you hear it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely breaking the hush that settled over the fields. Thomas nodded slowly, his sharp blue eyes scanning the waving stalks. "It's always there," he said, just beneath the sound of the wind, like voices trying to speak through the rustling. Maggie swallowed, her gaze fixed on the shadows that flickered between the cornstalks. "It's been getting worse, hasn't it? The whispers, the sightings. I thought maybe with the last sacrifice, we'd finally be free." Thomas shook his head, a grim line tightening his weathered face. "The darkness doesn't rest, Maggie. The fields remember." Across the village, Sheriff Daniel Crow paced the cracked floor of the town hall, his sheriff's hat set aside as he surveyed a hastily drawn map pinned to the wall. His stocky frame was rigid, the gruff exterior masking the tightening knot of worry in his chest. The patrols he had ordered were still in place, but the fear threading through the villages was palpable, and he knew that order was fragile at best. A sharp rap at the door heralded the arrival of Sarah Pike, the local farmer whose family had suffered terribly these past weeks. Her face was pale, eyes sunken and wide with terror. "Sheriff," she whispered, voice trembling, "I saw it again. In the corn, a shadow, watching, Crow's jaw clenched, where, near the eastern edge, by the old miller's plot. It didn't move like any man, Sheriff. It shifted, just stood there, watching me. I swear, it was the harvest spirit." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking like a stone. Crow rubbed his face, his pragmatic mind struggling to rationalize the impossible. "Well, send a patrol out immediately. Stay inside and lock your doors." But the dread had already seeped into every corner of Harrow's End. That night, Thomas found himself restless. The moon hung low and bright, casting a spectral glow over the fields. He wrapped his coat tighter around his lean frame and stepped outside, drawn once again to the whispering corn. The stalks swayed gently, but beneath their movement, the murmurs had grown into a low chant, almost pleading. He walked slowly into the heart of the field, senses alert to every sound, the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots, the cool night air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, shapes hinting at forms both human and otherworldly. The harvest spirit, ever elusive, seemed to watch with unseen eyes. Thomas stopped near a cluster of ancient cornstalks, the ground beneath them stained dark, the faint scent of iron rising from the soil. His breath came in shallow bursts as the whispers crescendoed, voices overlapping in a haunting harmony that chilled him to the bone. "Why do you linger?" he whispered, voice cracking. A sudden rustle stirred the stalks, and for a moment the shape of a figure emerged tall, shadowed, shifting in the moonlight. Thomas's heart pounded fiercely, but he held his ground, meeting the unseen gaze with a defiant stare. The whispering faded into silence, leaving a heavy stillness that pressed against his chest. He knew then that the darkness was far from gone. It was waiting, patient and hungry. Returning to the village, Thomas met Maggie near the old well, her face pale but resolute. "We can't stop watching," she said quietly. "The shadows are growing, and with them, the fear. But we have to hold on. For the village, for those still here." He nodded, feeling the weight of their shared burden. "We'll find a way," he promised, though the words felt fragile in the night air. As the village slept uneasily, the cornfields whispered on, secrets weaving through the stalks like threads of shadow. The harvest spirit lingered, a dark reminder that some pacts, once made, are never truly broken. And in Harrow's End, the shadows waited patiently for their moment to return. The morning sun spilled over the horizon like molten gold, bathing Harrow's End in a warm, almost forgiving light. The cornfields that had once whispered ominously in the night now stood tall and vibrant, their stalks swaying gently in the soft breeze as if offering a silent benediction. For the first time since the devastating events of last harvest, the village breathed a tentative sigh of relief. The air buzzed with cautious optimism, yet beneath the surface, an unmistakable tension lingered, a shadow of uncertainty that no amount of sunlight could fully dispel. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the fields, his sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon. The familiar rustling of the stalks was oddly comforting, but he could not shake the feeling that the silence between the rustles was just as significant, as though the fields were holding their breath. Beside him, Maggie Ellis adjusted the scarf around her neck, her auburn hair catching the light as she followed his gaze. "They look healthy," she said quietly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "Too healthy, maybe." Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered face taut with the weight of unspoken fears. "It's like they're trying to tell us something, or waiting." Around them, The village was awakening from a long, dark nightmare. The once fractured community had begun to stitch itself back together, though the scars were still raw and visible. The festival grounds, though subdued, were being cleaned and prepared for the annual celebration, a tradition that now felt both sacred and fragile. As Thomas and Maggie walked, they passed groups of villagers cautiously inspecting the crops, exchanging whispered conversations filled with a mix of relief and lingering dread. Sarah Pike, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, approached them, clutching a small bundle of wildflowers picked from the edge of the woods. "It's good to see the fields like this again," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can't stop thinking about what we lost." Maggie reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "We all feel it, but maybe this is a chance, a new beginning." Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Crow patrolled the village square, his weather-beaten face set in a grim line. The lawman had been skeptical of the supernatural claims at first, but the events of the past months had eroded even his hardened pragmatism. He exchanged nods with Thomas as they crossed paths. "Still hearing anything unusual out there?" Crow asked, his voice low. "Nothing concrete," Thomas replied, "but that doesn't mean the danger's gone." That evening, as dusk bled into night, Thomas and Maggie returned to the fields. The golden hues of the day faded into deep indigos and purples, and the whispering wind returned softer, more elusive. Thomas's heart pounded as the faint murmurs teased the edges of his hearing, stirring old fears. "Do you hear that?" Maggie whispered, her eyes wide. Thomas nodded, swallowing his dread. "It's like they're waiting for something, or someone." Their unease was shared by others. Old Man Harrow, the village elder whose cryptic warnings had once been dismissed as ramblings, stood alone atop a hill overlooking the fields. His gaze was fixed beyond the stalks, searching the horizon for signs only he seemed to perceive. A sudden chill swept through the air, and a shadow flickered momentarily among the cornstalks behind him, a fleeting glimpse that sent a shudder through his ancient bones. Back in the village, the memorial for those lost to the curse had become a place of quiet gathering. Families lit candles and shared stories, their voices low but resolute. The harvest festival was being planned once more, this time with a somber reverence that acknowledged the cost of prosperity. Thomas found himself caught between hope and fear. The fields might appear blessed, but the dark covenant etched into the soil of Harrow's End was not so easily broken. He knew the cycle of sacrifice and shadow could begin again at any moment, and he vowed to remain vigilant. As the village settled beneath a sky dusted with stars, the whispers carried on the wind, faint yet unmistakable. They were a reminder that beneath the new dawn lay the ever-present harvest of shadows, waiting patiently for its moment to return. And Thomas Grady, once a skeptic, now the reluctant guardian of his people's fate, stood ready to face whatever darkness awaited. The night deepened, and the fields rustled softly, as if alive with secrets yet to be told. Somewhere deep within the stalks, the ancient spirit stirred, biding its time. The cycle was far from over. To be continued. The dawn crept slowly over Harrow's End, painting the horizon with pale strokes of gold and pink that barely softened the chill in the air. The cornfields, once again lush and swaying gently in the morning breeze, seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting alongside the village for what might come. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the oldest field, his eyes scanning the undulating sea of stalks. Every rustle a potential message, every shadow a possible threat. Years of toil had weathered his frame, but the weight of the recent horrors pressed heavily upon his shoulders. His sharp blue eyes, tinged with the faintest hint of grey, reflected a resolve forged through fear and grief. Behind him, the village stirred cautiously. Survivors gathered in small clusters, their faces drawn and pale, the scars of loss etched deep. Maggie Ellis moved among them with steady purpose, her auburn hair catching the fragile light as she spoke softly, her voice a balm to their raw nerves. The old journal, now carefully guarded, lay open on the wooden table, its worn pages a reminder of the dark covenant that still bound them to the land. Though the fields had fallen silent for now, the knowledge of what might return settled like a shadow over every heart. Sheriff Daniel Crow paced near the doorway, his weather-beaten face set in grim lines. The lawman's pragmatism had been tested beyond its limits, yet he remained a steadfast pillar in a community teetering on the edge of despair. Eli Grady lingered close to Thomas, his younger brother's nervous energy a stark contrast to Thomas's steely calm. Their earlier tensions had softened, replaced by a mutual understanding born of shared trauma. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas led a small group to the site of the sacrificial altar deep within the cornfield. The ancient stones, entwined with creeping vines and faded symbols, held an eerie stillness that chilled the air. Thomas knelt, tracing the faint bloodstains that lingered, a cruel testament to the past and the grim choices made. The whispers that had haunted the village seemed to have retreated, but Thomas knew better than to trust the silence. The wind teased the leaves, carrying a faint murmur that brushed against his mind like a cold finger. "It's never truly gone," Maggie said quietly, joining him. "The spirit waits, watching, hungry." Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of the ancestral pact pressing down on him. "Then we keep watch. We protect what we can. This village, our home, is worth the fight." Night fell swiftly, wrapping Harrow's End in a blanket of quiet darkness, broken only by the soft rustling of corn. Thomas stood sentinel, the chill seeping into his bones as he listened for the faintest whisper and echo of the harvest spirit's lingering presence. The fields seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shadows shifting just beyond sight, hinting at the ancient hunger that might one day rise again. Behind him, the village held its breath, suspended between fragile hope and enduring dread. The harvest had ended, but the story was far from over. Thomas's gaze hardened, steeling himself for the uncertain dawn, ready to face whatever shadows the next season might bring. The legacy of Harrow's End was etched in blood and silence, a testament to the cost of survival and the price of forgotten pacts. As the wind whispered through the golden stalks, carrying voices both old and new, Thomas knew one truth above all: in this place, beneath these skies, the harvest of shadows would never truly end.